Okay, welcome to just a brief outline of the behaviourist approach in psychology. This short PowerPoint will go through what the approach is. You get an understanding of what Pavlov did. You may have heard him before, about learning and the very basic ways in which we learn, and these ideas of classical and operant conditioning and what they are. And you need to be able to talk about what classical and operant conditioning is and have the examples by the end. Right. Okay, all of this is AO1. Okay, so the behaviourist approach. Within every time we talk about approaches, you want to be able to say the key assumptions. Assumption is a key word for you. The assumptions are, and if ever you're writing them, you've got to write the 6 marker or the 12 marker or the 16 marker about what the behaviourist approach. Get straight in with a sentence starter. The assumptions are, the key assumptions are. Okay, and these are: only study behaviour that is observed or measured. So with some of the other approaches, when we look at it, for instance, the humanistic in A2 is really hard to measure and observe because it's too kind of wishy-washy in a way. This is, can I see the behaviour? Can it be observed? Can it be measured? Key assumption of behaviourist approach. It's not concerned with looking at higher mental processes when we look at maybe the psychodynamic or cognitive approach. And with all of these approaches, and I'll say this a lot in these videos, I expect, but you want to think of them as separate teams. What does this team do? What's good about this team as opposed to what's bad about that team, and what's good about that team? If ever you're wondering about what ones are, you just compare it to another one. So this isn't concerned with looking at the higher processes. Simple learning, and you'll see that from classical and operant conditioning. Believe that animals can replace humans in experimentation, as basic processes are the same. So when we look at the negatives, and you might already see this, if you use a lot of animals, rats, monkeys, pigeons, dogs in this instance, then it's very hard to what we call it extrapolate or generalize those findings to humans. So one of the negatives of the behaviourist approach will be that they use animals. Because, would you like me to basically say, oh, you're the same as a rat, you learn the same way as a rat? You might go, well, that's, I'm different, both psychologically and physically from a rat. Okay, so, but that's one of their main assumptions. So 3 ones, you can be observed and measured. It's not higher processes, it's basic learning, okay, and the animals are the same. And then from that, there's 2 key things you're going to learn: classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and you have to know them, key terms around them. I'll take them through. Okay, so classical conditioning is about association. If anyone says classical conditioning to you, say association. That's the key word straight away afterwards to get written down, underline it, highlighted. Classical conditioning, association. Okay, then Pavlov and his dogs. Okay, Pavlov was doing experiments on dogs. And he noticed that they started to salivate before the food was even there. So they were starting to associate things that were happening before the food got there. So he built this experiment up, and here it is from looking at these pictures. You've got food, bring the food, the dog salivates. Okay, so the salivation, saliva in the mouth helps break food down. Whenever you're talking about food, if you were to think about your favourite food now, it's a response, you can't control it, your mouth would start producing saliva. So food is the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response, and you need to get used to using these terms. The second one is this idea of a neutral stimulus. So he could have chosen anything. In this instance, it's a whistle. So if I came in the room to any dog, blew the whistle, and they've never heard a whistle before, then they would have no response. So the whistle means nothing to them. Okay, got that so far? Then you pair the 2 together. So every time I give the dog food, I blow the whistle. Here's some food, whistle. Here's some food, whistle. Here's some food, whistle. Okay? Then, after that, they've now been what we call conditioned, classically conditioned. I could walk into that room a month later, 2 months, 6 months later, blow the whistle, and the dog will salivate. Because the dog is going to associate the whistle with food. Okay, does that make sense? So you've got the top ones: food creates salivation. The whistle creates nothing, but then if you pair the whistle and the food together, okay, for long enough, you create a conditioned response to the whistle. Okay, and you may well have cats, dogs. You can train them up to do these things. Okay, Pavlov revealed that dogs could be conditioned to salivate if the sound of a bell, whistle, and the sound was repeatedly present at the same time that they were given food. They would salivate every time they heard the bell. Pavlov was able to show how a neutral stimulus, sorry, a neutral stimulus, the bell, could cause a learned response, salivating. Okay, and just always think those key terms, and in the lesson we'll probably give you these words. Put these words into paragraphs: conditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioning, conditioned response, unconditioned stimulus, and you have to figure out what these things are. It's really easy, but you just got to make sure you understand a conditioned response. They then associate the whistle with food. And that's it. That is classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, okay, goes a little bit further. If I said operant conditioning to you, you would want to say consequences straight away. Okay, you could say negative, positive, reinforcement, something like that. But classical conditioning association, operant conditioning, you say consequences. So this was all about learning via our consequences. So this is a person called Skinner, and he had something very famous called Skinner's box, which you can see a little bit there in the picture. He also did this with pigeons. You could stop, you go on the internet, put Skinner pigeons in, and you can see that he does all these things where he gets pigeons to turn around and tap at a box. It's quite cool to watch if you were that way inclined. But the basis here of operant conditioning, it goes a little bit further, suggests that learning is an active process where humans, animals operate in their environment. So we're always learning. Okay, if I put my finger and I get electrocuted, I'm not going to want to do that again because I've got what's called negative reinforcement. The three types of consequences for your behaviour. So anything we do, we're constantly learning, is this idea. We can have positive reinforcement, a treat, a sweet, a merit, a pat on the back, whatever it is. We could have negative reinforcement, so something doesn't happen, or we could have that punishment. Okay, positive reinforcement is receiving a reward for certain behaviours performed. Negative reinforcement occurs when an animal or human avoids something unpleasant. Okay, so if I'm deliberately not doing it, then that's negative reinforcement. Okay, and a punishment is obviously an unpleasant consequence of that behaviour. Okay, so there's this rat in there. He's got this lever. You can see things you point out. When a light goes on, he does something, he gets a pellet, positive reinforcement. What's that going to do for his learning? Well, he's far more likely to press the lever. Okay, and he was just showing that you can learn via this. Also, the electric shock, press the lever, electric shock. What's he not going to do again? Well, the rat's not going to press the lever. And he could show in animals basically with anything basic that they could learn through electric shocks or the positive reinforcement of food or whatever. Okay, so there it is. Operant conditioning is about consequence. Next lesson will be the negatives of this. Make sure before you stop this now, do you know the difference between classical and operant conditioning? Okay, do you know the three key assumptions of the behaviourist approach? If that is yes, you understand what Pavlov did, you understand how Skinner was different and more complex. Go and watch maybe a bit of Skinner on the internet, but otherwise you're good to go. Bye.